안녕하십니까. 오늘 이른 아침에 이렇게 많이 나와주셔서 대단히 고맙습니다. 그럼 지금부터 아침 렉처를 시작하겠습니다. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you again for joining us for this very special lecture this morning. The guest speaker this morning is Professor Eisuke Sakakibara, who is very well known, globally well known Japanese policymaker in the field of monetary and fiscal policy, and also is a very distinguished economist. So he is very well-known figure, globally well-known figure. In fact, he had a long career, very, very outstanding and successful career in his government, particularly at the Ministry of Finance. Actually, he served various key posts, particularly in the area of international affairs in the Ministry of Finance. During his tenure at the ministry, he earned his very globally well-known nickname, Mr. Yen. Sakakibara is well known as Mr. Yen, and he earned that name during his tenure at the Ministry of Finance. In fact, he was Vice Minister of Ministry of Finance for International Affairs, and during 1997 and 1998, during the Asian financial crisis. In fact, he was the one who, for the first time, floated the idea of establishing Asian Monetary Fund as a Japanese government official. In any case, he came out with this idea of establishing monetary fund, Asian Monetary Fund. But now, as we have a Chiang Mai Initiative and many other things in variant form, but in any case, he was the Japanese government official who floated that idea. Well, Professor Sakakibara spoke here at this forum before. Actually, I look up our record. He spoke in 15 years ago for the first time. 2003 and then 2006 too. But anyway, we've been friends for many years, and we've been serving in various same committees and councils. For his very outstanding service for his government, he was awarded with the various prestigious and honorable honors and medals from the Japanese government, including the Order of Sacred Treasure and the Silver and Gold Star, which are very, very prestigious honor, and anyone can get from his government. This morning, he will enlighten us with his insights and illuminating views on the landscape of Asia, especially focusing on, of course, China, Japan, and India. India in particular, Actually, Professor Sakakibara has been engaged in various research regarding Indian economy for some time now. And India, as you know, is a very, very rapidly rising economy. Now the fastest growing among major emerging economic powers. So India has great potential, and we should pay more attention to India. And this morning, I'm very sure the Professor Sakakibara will enlighten us in this regard. Currently, he is with the Aoyama Gakuen University. He runs an institute for doing research in Indian economy. And he actually visited Seoul this time very briefly for this lecture, and I appreciate very much for your taking time to come to Seoul for this occasion. Well, with no further ado, I would like to ask Dr. Song to moderate the session with Professor Sakakibara. Well, please join me in thanking Professor Sakakibara for giving this opportunity to us.
Dr. Eisuke, thank you very much for a very kind introduction. Well, today I was given the title Asia's New Economic Landscape, including China, Korea, and Japan. Before talking about the current Asian conditions and its future, let me first review the developments in this area during the past decade or so. Well, Asia had been the center of the world economy until the middle of the 19th century. As late as 1820, according to the well-known historian by Angus Madison, China had 29% of the world GDP, while India had 16% of the world GDP. So in early 19th century, China and India had almost half of the world GDP. At that time, United States had only 1.8% of the GDP. So, this, and if you go back from 19th century to 18th, 17th, and 16th century, share of China and India increases as well. It is estimated that in 1,500, the Chinese and Indian share was as large as 70%. So, but decline of Asia has started from the middle of the 19th century. As you are well aware that the colonization by the West started to take place from the middle of the 19th century. In 1820, there was Opium War, and in 1842, Hong Kong and the Kowloon Peninsula was colonized by the UK. And in 1857, Mughal Empire in India perished, and India became the colony of the United Kingdom in 1877. As a matter of fact, Japan was the only country which maintained independence during that time. Of course, Thailand did maintain the nominal independence, but it was actually under the control of United Kingdom. But after the World War II, Asian countries became independent one by one. In 1947, Philippines declared independence. 47, India declared independence. And 49, Vietnam, Myanmar declared independence. In 49, the Communist Party took the Chinese regime, and in 1953, Laos and Cambodia became independent. So this is called the reorient, Asia's re-emergence in the world economy, and Asia become the highest growing, region in the world. It was headed by Japan in between 1956 and 73. Japan grew at the annual rate of 9.1%, which was called high growth period for Japan. Between 1974 and 1990, it was called a stable growth period. Japanese growth rate has been about 4.2%. Japan was followed by Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. Between 1980 and 1999, annual average growth rate for Korea was as high as 7.96%. Singapore, 6.26%, Taiwan, 7.55%, Hong Kong, 5.54%. From around the 1990s, both China and India moved from the planned economy to the market economy and started to grow at a very high rate. Between 1979 and 2008, during those 30 years, annual growth rate of China was as high as 9.8%. It was followed by Singapore, 7.0%, Vietnam, 6.6%, Myanmar, 6.4%, Malaysia 6.3, Korea 6.3, Taiwan 6.3, Laos 6.1. During that time, US growth rate was only 2.9%, and Japanese growth rate was only 2.6%. So during this 30 years, between 1979 and 2008, Asia was the highest growing region in the world. This is the period which is called the reorient, Asia's re-emergence in the world economic scene. However, in recent years, China has been moving from high growth period to stable growth period. Chinese growth rate is now around 6.5%. As I said, it used to be around 10%. But now, it has come down to 7%, and it is estimated by International Monetary Fund that in 2018, this year, Chinese growth rate would come down to 6.6%. In the meantime, India's growth rate has increased, and India's growth rate in 2018, this year, is estimated to be 7.36%. Around 2014 and 2015, growth rate of China and India has reversed. India's growth rate has surpassed that of China in 2014. The ASEAN countries has been growing at a very high speed as well. This year, Myanmar is supposed to grow at 6.9%, Cambodia 6.9%, and Laos 6.8%, Philippines 6.7%, and Vietnam 6.6%. So growth rates, high growth period in the Asian region has moved from east to west, originally from Japan and Korea, and then ASEAN countries, and to India. India has been rising in terms of its growth rates, and it has further potential to grow because its nominal GDP is still very low. India's nominal GDP is only 1/5 of China's and 1/8 of United States. So if managed well, India has a lot of potential to grow at 7%, 8% for some years to come. And one sort of merit of India is that Indian population is growing, while Chinese population is gradually declining, and China is aging, like Japan, decline in the population and aging. Japan ahead the other countries in Asia, but China followed Japan in that point. And currently, Chinese population is 1.34 billion, while Indian population is 1.24 billion. But by 2050, China's population would not really change that much. It is estimated that in 2050, the Chinese population would be 1.36, which is virtually the same as the population now. But Indian population is estimated to grow to 1.66 billion, which is 20%, 25% increase from their current population. And another good thing about population increase in India is that Indian composition of the population is very young at this moment. 54% of the Indian population right now is below the age of 25 years. So that during the next 2-3 decades, working age population would increase quite rapidly in India. That will really India's growth rate. According to the estimate of PricewaterhouseCoopers, which is some American consulting firm, India is estimated to grow at 4.9% average between 2015 to 2050. So among the big countries in the world, this is the highest growth rates. U.S. growth rate during that time is 2.4, and Japanese growth rate during that time is 1.4%. So only couple of countries like Nigeria, Vietnam, and Bangladesh exceed India in terms of the growth rate. Nigeria 5.4%, Vietnam 5.3%, Bangladesh 5.1%, and India 4.9%. And India right now is under good hand. And Narendra Modi is the Prime Minister, and he has started this BJP government. As you know, Narendra Modi was the Chief Minister of state of Gujarat, most advanced state, industrially advanced state in India, for 14 years. And with the success of his performance in the state of Gujarat, he became the head of president of BJP in May 2014, and he has been running the country fairly skillfully since. And India, as I said previously, is growing at 7-8% for extended period right now. And India has good relationship with Korea and Japan. Particularly, India's relationship with Japan is very favorable. Japan has some negative legacy with regard to your country and China because of our aggression or colonization, before the World War II. So there are, at times, some hiccups in diplomatic relationships. But India, in terms of India, Japan helped India to become independent. Some of the Congress party is sort of leftist, like Chandra Bose, came to Japan and conducted his independence movement from Japan. And Japan did, join Chandra Bose and Bihari Bose in fighting against United Kingdom in Impal in 1944, although the operation was not successful. Well, because of this sort of rapid increase in the growth rates of India, it is estimated by PricewaterhouseCoopers that India's GDP would surpass that of the United States in 2050. According to their estimate, this is an estimate by one consulting firm, According to PricewaterhouseCoopers, in 2050, largest GDP it was held by China, and Chinese GDP would be 61.79 trillion US dollars. But China is followed by India. India would become number 2. And India sort of GDP would be 42.21 trillion US dollars, which is larger than that of the United States. The US GDP in 2050 is estimated to be 41.38 trillion US dollars, which is a little bit below that of India. And China, India, and US is followed by Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, and Japan. And in 2050, 4 out of top 7 countries are Asian countries. So you could say that, late 20th century and early 21st century would be the century of the Asian countries. And growth center has moved from east to west, from Japan to Korea to Taiwan, Hong Kong, to China, and now to India. Lots of manufacturing companies in Japan are now entering Japan. As you know, lot of Korean companies are already there. And particularly Japanese car producers like Toyota and Honda has established their sort of operations quite aggressively in India. Of course, one major sort of car producers in India is Suzuki. Suzuki is not a major car producer in domestic market, but Suzuki has responded to Indian sort of request to have a sort of national car, and Suzuki has formed the joint farm called Suzuki Maruti, with the consent of the Indian government. And this Suzuki Maruti right now has 60% of the share of the Indian market. So Suzuki's sales of the cars is bigger in India than in Japan. And this was quite a successful sort of venture by the head of Suzuki called Osamu Suzuki, who responded to the Indian request to have a national car. As I said, growth center has been moving from east to west, and eventually from India, growth center may still go farther to the west, to the Middle East, to Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq, and to East African countries. Particularly a country like Nigeria. And Korea, China, and Japan are, in a sense, competing in those areas as competitors. But cooperation among those 3 countries could be quite beneficial as well, mutually beneficial. And there are various organizations who help, those countries to operate in those areas. Of course, Asian Development Bank is one organization which helps the development of Asia. ADB is sort of dominated by Japan. ADB president has always been Japanese, and Japanese share in ADB is close to 16%, which is the same to the US. So US and Japan sort of dominates the management of ADB. Because of that, China has established another organization which is called AIIB, with now 57 countries, including most of the European countries, participate in AIIB. Although Japan and the United States have not yet participated in AIIB. But in my personal opinion, I think we should join. Yeah, I think Japan will eventually join AIIB as well. As a matter of fact, AIIB chairman, who is Chinese, used to be the deputy chairman of ADB. And he has expressed the desire to cooperate very closely to Asian Development Bank. And the Asian Development Bank president, Mr. Nakao, who used to work with me in the Ministry of Finance, has also expressed that he is willing, ADB is willing, to cooperate very closely to AIIB. To some extent, they could be complementary. There are lots of areas to cover for ADB. So with the ADB and AIIB, they could cover more Asian countries, and they could have complementary operations and mutually beneficial operations in the Asian region. Well, if you sort of look at the world economy at this moment, I think developed part of the world, United States, Europe, Japan, Korea included, I think has matured to a certain extent. Their growth rate has come down. But I don't think it's a weakening of those economies. I think it is a maturity of those economies. Per capita GDP of those countries has reached at a very high level, 40,000, 50,000 sort of US dollars, which is a very high level of living standard. So with that kind of maturity, with that kind of high level of living standard, it is only natural that growth rate would come down. So for most of the developed countries, growth rate is around 1%. And of course, inflation has come down as well. The inflation rate is around 1% as well. So that low growth rates, low inflation has become the major sort of characteristics of most of the developed countries. Developed countries. Of course, US is somewhat of an exception. US still grows at 2%. US does have an element of developing countries because of structure of their sort of nations. Hispanic population and African population are increasing, quite rapidly. So US is the only country where the population is growing, while country like Japan, population is declining, and some European countries, population is declining. But US does have somewhat different character from other developed countries. But now, as I said, as those developed countries come to the stage of maturity and the growth rate, comes down to 1%, emerging economies like China and India and Middle East countries and East African countries would become the growth center of the world. I think it was in 1999, American author called Andre Gunder Flunk has published the book entitled Reorient. That means the center of the world has once more become the Orient, Asia. The center of the world economy has come back to Asia. And Orient as above, as you know, means changing the course. So that by this book, Reorient, it means world economy is changing its course. And the center of the world economy has now become Orient, the Asia. And Asia has become the fastest growing sort of region of the world in the 21st century. And I think, India probably is the key in this development. As you know, India's influence is quite significant in Middle East and the Eastern African countries. Chinese merchants has gone to Southeast Asian countries like Myanmar, Vietnam, and so on. But they went as far as to India. But Indian merchants has gone to the west, to Middle East countries and East African countries. So the west of India could be said to be the region which is heavily influenced by India or Indian merchants. So Chinese sort of influence area is up to India, and India's influence area is west of India. And Indians are quite active in the Middle East and in East African countries. So I think we should really closely watch how India sort of performs in those regions west of India. Of course, China would continue to be very important. And in 2050, according to the estimate of PricewaterhouseCoopers, China would be number one in GDP, followed by India and the United States. But Chinese sort of growth rate would eventually goes down to around 3% by 2050. Chinese population eventually would decline and population would age, so that their growth rate, which is around 6.5%, is estimated to go down gradually to 3%. However, Indian growth rate would probably continue to be around 7-8% for some years to come. So India would be among the big countries of the world, fastest growing region, fastest growing country, and India's merit, as I may have said before, is that their population composition is very young. So that working sort of age population would increase in the next 3-4 decades. And this increase, particularly increase of working age population, would maintain the high growth rate for India. But India, particularly for a country like Japan and maybe Korea, is a difficult country to understand. I always say to my Japanese people that India is probably the opposite sort of corner from Japan. If you sort of describe Japan in one word, homogeneity. Language is the same, and people are quite similar, and throughout history, we have never been invaded by other countries. Okay, so it's a very homogeneous country. If you sort of describe India in one word, diversity, it's quite diverse. In terms of the races, originally it was occupied by Dravida race, but BC 15 or so, earlier race has come down, and eventually from Asia, Africa, and Iran, people has sort of come down to India. India was just in the middle of the Eurasia Peninsula, so that lots of sort of races has come down to that country. In terms of the religion, it's very diverse as well. Of course, 80% is Hindu, but about 15% is Islam. And there are 2% Christians, and there are 2% Sikh. As you know, that Manmohan Singh, former Prime Minister of India, was Sikh. Sikh people do have turbans to hide their long hairs. And of course, India is the country where the Buddhism has originated. So that there are lots of religions coexisting in India. So even in terms of the religion, it's a very diverse, and happy coexistence of the religions have been maintained in India. Well, as I said, Japan has maintained a very good diplomatic relationship with India throughout the last 50, 100 years. Indian sort of Congress people, particularly left wing of the Congress people, like Chandra Bose, Bihari Bose, conducted their independence movement from Japan. And Japan has helped India to become independent. Of course, at that time, Japan was fighting against the US and UK. So that fighting with UK, in turn means helping independence of India. So that because of that history, Indian-Japanese relationship has been quite favorable, throughout the last 50 and 100 years. Well, for the countries like Japan and Korea, where the domestic growth potential is limited, we could grow at 1%, 2%, but Japan could never sort of expect the domestic economy to grow 3%, 4%, 5% anymore. Maybe in your country, you could do better than Japan. But for a country like Japan, we have to go abroad to sort of reap the benefits of the high growth of the countries like China and India. It has gone to China quite sort of substantially. And now lots of Japanese producers, particularly car producers, part producers, are now in India. Toyota is there, Honda is there, so Maruti Suzuki is there, and they are expecting the demand for the car purchase in India would grow quite significantly, quite rapidly in the next 2 or 3 decades. So that India is now the country where many sort of nations, developed Asian nations like Korea, Japan, and others are looking to as a place for active investment. Well, in concluding, I would say that Asia has been expanding from east to west, and to capture its dynamism, its development from east to west is very important to understand new economic scene, the new Asia's economic landscape, which is the title, of the today's speech. I was asked by the organizers of this speech to touch on the important subject for Korea, which is the Inter-Korea Summit and the upcoming UK-North Korea Summit. Well, of course, you know much better than I do, but since I was asked, to comment on that, some brief comment may be necessary. Well, as you are well aware, Korea is now the only country which is divided between North and South after Germany has united. And, peaceful integration, eventual integration of Korea is quite helpful to the region. As a matter of fact, for a country like Japan, North Korea has been a national security threat. And, it may be true for other countries as well. So that, accommodations, some kind of peaceful sort of integration, eventual integration of North and South Korea would be quite helpful to the region's peaceful coexistence. And we welcome the North Korea's participation in the international community, and eventually, the integration of the Korean Peninsula would be desirable, and I hope that could be achieved within next decade or 2 decades. I wouldn't expect that to happen next year or 2 years from now, but the state of dividedness should be overcome and could be overcome within next decade or 2 decades. Well, thank you very much. I have finished my preparations, speech preparation. So I'd be very happy to answer any of the questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sakakibara, for your overview of the Indian economy and Japan-Indian bilateral relations, and as well as implications on the economies in the region. And with that, I'd like to open the floor. Do I see any hands?
I'd be happy to answer any questions not related to my speech as well. Yeah.
Ambassador Singh.
Thank you for your presentation. The development of Asian region, I think, hinges on China's move, particularly the Belt and Road. And do you think any some contradiction between China's Belt and Road and the other countries' effort to develop the economy? Because China's Belt and Road is almost monopolizing everywhere, even in the eastern part of Africa. So that is my question.
I don't disagree with you at all, but China is a major sort of giant country in the world, and its GDP would probably surpass that of the United States within next 10 years. So that country like Japan and Korea needs to closely associate with China, despite what you have just described, and ambitions of China in terms of dominating the region. However, I think Japan has some kind of a negative legacy vis-a-vis China because of Japanese aggression, during the World War II and before the World War II. So that diplomatic relationship with China and Japan isn't really that good. However, it is very important, I think, for the Japanese authority to build a good diplomatic relationship with China. China's presence would increase. Of course, for countries like Korea and Japan, alliance with the U.S. is very important. We should keep that, okay? And with that alliance with the United States, we should improve our relationship with China. And that would be desirable, for the region. And that, if Korea and Japan and other Asian countries cooperate together, we may be able to take China's, too ambitious desire to dominate the region. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Sakakibara, for your excellent overview. Focusing on the macro picture you have presented, I'm very much interested in, of course, the long-term view of the Asia's dominance in the future, of course, is inevitable and everybody says it, but more in terms of the time frame I'm looking at it. The price warehouse model you have inside is, of course, based on the macroeconomic model, which is equations, basically. what's lacking in there are some of the other elements which is not necessarily mathematical. One aspect, India and China's growth is very different from the economic development of the West. Is that in the West, economic development followed cultural development, science and everything else to go with it. The economic development in China as well as India is very rapid.
Very what?
Very rapid.
Uh-huh.
But it is exceeding the societal growth. In the case of India, the culture, the morality. In China also, it's diversity. You mentioned the diversity. The diversity is very much of a hindrance in unified development of the country. You have been on the scene of the economic development of the world in the last about 40 years, I remember. Putting that into your mind, how do you think those negative factors will slow down their growth, continuing the growth, as China has to struggle with the internal problems, India has to struggle with the issues like morality, religions, etc. It's not just the machines and the trades to develop the economies. Do you think the macro model of predictions are that accurate? Thank you.
Well, macro model could be inaccurate in sometimes, but well, with regards to China and India, I particularly with regard to India, I mentioned the diversity, and diversity, it could be a negative factor, of course, but diversity could be, if managed well, diversity could become a positive factor for that country, and of course, coming from a country which is very homogeneous, like Japan, I don't know how to really manage those diversity well. But to some extent, I think Indian government has sort of managed those diversity quite efficiently. Of course, they have now established nationwide sort of sales tax and try to sort of unify the country, gradually. However, as you know, India is quite different from state to state, and it's sort of a United States of India. One state is quite different from the other state, and even the language is different. So it is a very difficult country to unite. But so far, I think Narendra Modi government has been doing fairly good job to unite that country, to have a sort of nationwide tax regime, and I think that effort is now still on its way. But I think that kind of unifying efforts would continue and would probably be quite beneficial to India. And as I said, Japan as a country do not know how to sort of cope with the so-called diversity. But I think if a government sort of manages well diversity, as I said earlier, it could be a plus for a country like India. I don't know if I really answered your question or not. Any other questions?
No. It's a really pleasure to see you again. And first simple question: what is your secret to maintain such good health and great global perspective? Second, when the U.S. President Donald Trump was here in Korea to deliver a speech at the Korea's National Assembly, he tossed out the concept of Indo-Pacific, and in which actually President Trump encouraged Korea to play a sort of linchpin role. My question is that Japan and the U.S. and Australia and India are a crucial component of those Indo-Pacific. And would you like to elaborate, further what is Japanese stance on the Indo-Pacific concept? Is this a security alliance or security alliance plus or economic collaboration entity? I'm not sure which direction you're moving. And is this basically the sort of idea to check China's rise? And that is my personal the interpretation. I don't know whether you agree with me. My view is that Korea also should join the Indo-Pacific concept forever, security-wise as well as economic collaboration entity. My second question is related to, you said this Japan should join the AIIB down the road. According to early of the AIIB, the management, Chinese seems to me running AIIB for their own interest in terms of the territorial expansion or to expand China's influence over the Central Asia, even the African continent. So what is your view on this China's AIIB management? Is this really serving as international public goods to provide funding for the global the project? And if Japan joins, you think this Japan can influence AIIB's governance so that AIIB can truly serve as an international public goods financial institution? But Korea has already joined AIIB, and when do you think if Japan will join AIIB, if, as you said, Japan will do that down the road? Thank you.
Well, I may not be on the majority side in Japan, but I am quite sort of optimistic about the development of AIIB. And as I said earlier, I think we should, along with the United States, join AIIB. And I think it is quite possible that ADB could cooperate quite closely with AIIB. And ADB sort of chairman, President Nakao, has said that he would be willing to cooperate with AIIB for the development of Asian countries. So and China is expecting eventually that Japan and the United States would participate in AIIB. And I think by participating in AIIB, particularly Japan and US together, would be able to reduce Chinese influence, Chinese dominance of AIIB. So that my view is that we should join AIIB and, would sort of exert some influence, along with the US, to check the Chinese dominance in AIIB. And I think China is willing to accept that. China is willing to accept the participation by Japan and the United States in AIIB. And it has said that, I think, publicly, that they welcome the participation of Japan and United States in that organization. And my view is, as I said, we should join, quickly to that organization and to sort of forge some kind of collaboration between ADB and AIIB in the development of Asian countries. Well, what was your first question? I forgot. I'm sorry.
Indo-Pacific.
Oh, I see. Indo-Pacific sort of projects. As I said, Mr. Trump has said that, and it is to some extent to check the Chinese influence in this region. But I think it is quite important that Japan would form close relationship with India, Japanese relationship with Southeast Asian countries are already very close. So that Southeast Asian countries and India, Korea and Japan, those belts of corporations, I think would be quite helpful. And as I said earlier, India-Japanese relationship has been quite favorable for the last 50, 100 years. And it is, and I think Japan and India is the only country, as far as Japan is concerned, that the mutual visit of the Prime Minister has become a rule. Every year, Japanese Prime Minister visit. Every other year, Japanese Prime Minister visits India. Every other year, Indian Prime Minister visits Japan. So that Japanese-Indian relationship has been quite favorable. And perception of the Japanese people and perception of the Indian people vis-a-vis other countries has been quite favorable. So that I think this belt, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, and India, that would work. And as Mr. Trump is intending, that may be some kind of counterforce to Chinese influence, Chinese big influence in this region. Of course, we need to maintain good relationship with China as well. So it's not an easy task, but having a very close relationship with India, I think is very important. To check, to reduce too much sort of influence by China. So that I think I'm one of those Japanese who are promoting much deeper, much closer relationship with India, and that would really be a beneficial sort of attempt to balance, to sort of maintain and keep the sort of balance within this region. China is a big country. We should not antagonize China in any sense. However, we should be able to create some kind of sort of alliance, in Asia to counter too much sort of dominance by China. And I think relationship with India, is very important for that matter.
Any other questions? If there's no question, well, you said India is a very young country with a very young population. And people have been said India has a great potential for so many years. But their potential, it seems like, has not been materialized fully. And what are the reasons, I think, for that?
Well, I cannot pinpoint the reason, for what you have pointed out. India has been sort of lagging behind China, for the development. But now, I think Indian performance has become quite favorable. India has been growing at 7%, 8%, and it looks like it is going to continue. 7%, 8% growth rate for some time to come. So that India may be finally sort of, reviving. And I think, one thing is that Indian middle class is now growing, and because of that, demand for cars, for example, demand for sort of electric appliances has been increasing quite rapidly there. So potentially it's very lucrative markets for Korean companies, Japanese companies to get in. And actually they are getting into the Indian market for that matter. So that, as I said, population is growing. Not only that population is growing, but middle class may be starting to be formed in a very large sort of scale. So if that happens, if 50%, 60% of the Indian population would become, the middle class, then that would be a very sort of lucrative market, very productive market, and the possibility of that happening, growing middle class in India, I think is quite high. I may be too optimistic, but that kind of view could be maintained, looking at what has happened to India during the last several years. I think Narendra Modi has been doing very well. He is doing a good job, to sort of let that country to grow at a very high speed. And as I said, India's GDP is still very low, 1/5 of China. So it has a good potential to grow if managed well. So far, it has been managed fairly well. That is my view. Yeah. Yes.
China invaded across Himalaya in 1960s to take the lands they thought that was theirs from India. How do the Indians remember the invasion by the Chinese army across Himalaya? Do they have any resentment, or do they think it's just as nothing is gone by?
Well, I do not know that particular issue that well. I have never asked the Indian sort of government about that issue, but I think India's diplomatic relationship with China is not necessarily that bad. And Indian current government has said that it is conducting its diplomacy in all directions. That means that it does, desire to improve relationship with China. So that I think Indian current government is not anti-China and is trying, at least gradually, to improve relationship with China. And I do not know whether some kind of vengeance remains among the minds of the Indian people. But as far as I know, from the government announcement and so on, it seems to be having, a good diplomatic relationship to all countries, including China. So, as far as I'm concerned, I do not worry about Indian-Chinese conflicts in the years to come, at least for some time.
Yes.
This kind of relates to what Dr. Song mentioned a minute ago. There's a book called The Kimchi Matters, written by...
Kimchi Matters.
Written by a political economist and some political consultant. It's an old book, but written about 2003, so that before the rise of India, certainly, and the beginning of, the middle of the rise of China. The authors use the word kimchi to refer to local dynamics. In other words, investors need to understand the local dynamics instead of imposing values from outside. And regarding India and China, the point they made really stuck with me over the last 15 years. People very often describe India as the largest democracy in the world. And then the critics of democracy often use that expression to actually impugn democracy, meaning democracy is not what it's meant out to be. But the authors made the point that long term, Indian people are more optimistic, more open-minded, more innovative because they have the illusion of having democracy, having the illusion of having control over their lives, because they can vote out local government, they can vote out provincial government, they can protest, no problems are hidden. There are lots of problems, but no problems hidden. Whereas China, you don't have that. There's no outlet, even though on the surface there's simply a lot of control. but authors seem to put more weight on Indian side in terms of long-term sustainability of regime and the health of society. So maybe you can comment on that.
It may be somewhat different from what you have asked, but what I'm really impressed by India is that Indian elite, our quality is very superb. And there are lots of Indians living in the United States. But some of them have come back to India to hold key positions. Raghuram Rajan, for example, has become the governor of the central bank. He has now gone back to University of Chicago. But like Raghuram Rajan, lots of sort of Indians who have lived in the United States have come back to India to occupy key positions. I think that's quite important. There are lots of competent Indians living in the United States, and at least some of them coming back to take line in the Indian government means that they are now hopeful for the future of India. And there's no question that the quality of Indian elite, I'm very much impressed by that. So I think if you if this kind of trend continues, competent Indians coming back from the United States and Europe to take key positions in India, India's sort of performance would continue to be favorable and even improve. And as I said, I'm quite sort of optimistic that India would continue to grow, at 7%, 8% for the decade or 2 decades. Yes.
My name is Bert Brauner. I'm with the German embassy here in Seoul. Mm-hmm. May I come back to the AIIB issue?
Yes.
First, a short comment. Germany decided to join the AIIB very quickly, despite the friendly advice of the United States not to do so. And I can also only recommend to join this institution, because then you have a chance to influence it, not from the outside.
Yes.
But now my question on the AIIB, but also on the ADB, according to your economic knowledge and your overview over Asia, what should be the focus countries and focus areas for both multilateral financial institutions, like energy infrastructure, whatever, and which countries? Because I think there is a lot of kind of internal fighting also on what to concentrate. Like even if you take Korea, I think Korea doesn't have big deficiency in physical infrastructure, but you have the environmental and energy problem, for example. And other countries like Vietnam, still developing, emerging, they have both at the same time physical infrastructure problems still, and the environmental and energy problem at the same time, like China and many other Asian countries. So what should be the focus from your point of view?
Well, first of all, as I said, ADB and AIIB should cooperate and could, sort of perform the complementary functions in developing, the Asian countries. But I think the focus should be India and, countries west of India. Well, Southeast Asian countries has been fairly well developed and may not need further substantial aid from international organizations like ADB and AIIB. But India needs that, and as I said, India has a lot of potential to grow at this moment. And Middle East, Middle East Asian countries and East African countries need their sort of help as well. So that I think ADB and AIIB efforts should move eventually to West, and I think that's very important. And as I said, Germany has joined AIIB very quickly, and my view is, as I may have said, Japan should join quickly. And I don't know why they have hesitated so far, because of probably the United States. US is probably trying to stop Japan from participating in AIIB, because so far it has been dominated by China. At least it is perceived by the United States it is dominated by China. But by US and Japan participating in AIIB, dominance could be weakened quite substantially. So I think we should join very quickly, like Germany. Okay?
Okay. Let me go with some specific questions. I agree with that. India is very difficult to understand, and the Indian bureaucracy is very, very famous in handling all the international projects. For example, in the energy area, there are 6 different ministries, each speaking their own voices. I know that Japan now is carrying on a huge national project in India, connecting the Mumbai and New Delhi, establishing a new industrial corridor. My question is that to what extent Japanese ODA plays the role in winning the Japanese national project? And second, the Indian companies and the local government really prefer sort of the project financing done by the investing companies by themselves. So in this regard, how Japanese companies managing to provide a sort of the project financing the way in which Indian local government wishes to have. So in this regard, I think the Japanese companies may feel any risk in terms of the project financing, and sometimes they look for some international consortium within their own Japanese companies or some foreign companies. For example, a Korean company can work within a specific the SOC project with Japanese companies. So I would like to hear your view on this and any specific examples of success or failure in terms of carrying out a specific project in India.
Well, maybe you know much better than I do about this subject, but let me say that Japanese companies, as I said, has been very eager, to sort of get into the specific industries in India, particularly the car companies, car producing companies, and car parts companies, and they are very aggressive as well. Toyota has established a big sort of establishment in Bangalore, and followed by Honda and other car producing companies. So many Japanese companies are now seeing India as a growing, rapidly growing sort of markets, and something like demand for the cars would really rapidly increase, so that investment in India seems to be on the high tide at this moment, and I think it's going to continue for some time to come. After China, many Japanese say India is the destination of the Japanese investment.
Well, if you have a question, yes.
Just a question. So right now in Korea, we have a good moment for the inter-Korean relations.
Could you be louder? Yeah.
Yeah. So, but the Korean young people, they are not. Some of the Korean young people, they are not sure about that unification of the two countries will make a good effect in terms of the economy.
So we have seen that in German case, after reunification in Germany, in the beginning times they had some difficulty, but right now that the German economy is so strong and very stable. So I don't know that, I'm not sure, but what your advice or your opinion after the reunification, it will make a good opportunity for Korea in terms of economy?
Well, German unification on the whole may have been quite successful, but they still have some problems, particularly in East Germany, as I understand. So that unification is not an easy task. But I think eventually with passage of the time, unification would create positive results. So that I think Korean unification, if achieved, would eventually, you may have some kind of problems in the initial stage. There's no question about that. You have different regimes and you have different sort of modes of operation and so on. But I think looking at Vietnam, looking at Germany, and all those sort of countries which are sort of merged, with the lapse of the time, it has functioned fairly efficiently. So that I think at the initial stage you may have some problems if you unify the two regimes. They are completely different, but I think with the passage of the time, unification would create a positive results. You may not agree with me, you may know much better than I do about that, but that is my desire.
Okay, if there's no more questions from the floor, I'd like to end this breakfast forum by thanking Dr. Sakakibara for his time and very good talk and interaction. Please join me in thanking.
Thank you very much.